Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with Dr. Jason Staples to talk about his paper, Jesus being Lord, Lord in Matthew and Luke's Gospel. Actually, I should just get the precise title up to make sure I'm getting it right. The paper was actually recommended to me by Matthew J. Thomas, I believe a mutual friend of ours from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. And okay, here's the paper. It's Lord, Lord, Jesus as I don't know how you feel about me saying the divine name with the vowels, but okay. So Jesus as Yahweh in Matthew and Luke. Dr. Staples, it's really great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here. And again, sorry for the delay and when we were about to record this. Those who might be listening afterwards might not realize that I held things up a little bit here. So
Oh, that's okay. Yep. Well, Dr. Staples, you're also the author. I see you have the book in the background there of The Idea of Israel and Second Temple Judaism. And so that's a major accomplishment there. Not the subject of today's interview, but I wanted the people to know about that. And maybe in the future, we can talk about your work there. But this paper in particular really captivated me as, I guess, a proof text that I hadn't heard too often used in defense of maybe the deity of Christ or what have you. So, Dr. Staples, could you just begin by actually introducing yourself? I got a little too far ahead of myself there.
yeah, so I don't really even know where to start. I'm presently working as an adjunct, as a assistant teaching professor at NC State University, and did my PhD work at the University of North Carolina, and then before that did a master's and a bachelor's at Florida State. So have been around a little bit, mostly in the ACC. So I've taught a few other places, but that's where I am now, and my work has focused primarily on Second Temple Judaism stuff, and then some New Testament and early Christianity material in the context of Second Temple Judaism, or early Judaism, if you prefer. And that includes, of course, the book that you just mentioned, and then I've got a book coming out this year on. It's called Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, where you're looking at basically developing how early Christians, or the earliest Christians, Paul being our earliest source for Christianity, are developing the ideas that are put forward in that first book about the identity and concept of who Israel is after the exile.
Well, Dr. Staples, in this particular paper, you talk about Jesus in Matthew and Luke's Gospel, and I'm interested in just asking you to kind of give a brief overall summary of the argument in the paper.
Yeah, the basics of this paper are, it basically grew out of a pretty simple realization. So this was years ago. I was in a prophets class. Actually, it's funny because both books that I've put out and then this paper all came out of the same prophets class when I was a junior in undergrad. And I was in a prophets class at the time, and we were covering, I think it was Ezekiel, and the instructor of that class made an observation about basically what was going on, where God addressed Ezekiel, and the way that it was referred to there, he said, well, the Lord said to me. Since in Ezekiel this was Adonai, it was Adonai plus the name, and he wrote this up on the board in English, Adonai, and then the Tetragrammaton. And I was sitting there, and it had just never occurred to me to hear it that way. But all of a sudden, I heard it that way and went, "Wait, Lord, I've heard that before." And so it just occurred to me that when Jesus says this, and he says it on 3 separate occasions in the Synoptic Gospels. Twice in Matthew and once in Luke, that when Jesus uses this Lord, Lord phrase, it's sort of jarring. Like, why double it there? And it occurred to me that he might be tagging those passages where you have the doubled Adonai in the Hebrew Bible. And and of course, for those listeners who are not as familiar with this, Adonai is the most common circumlocution or substitution for when you read the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH or YHWH in English, which again you vocalized earlier. And in my training, that's just not, you generally are just trained not to vocalize it, and that's very old Jewish tradition is
Right.
when you're reading the Hebrew Bible, you read, instead of reading the consonants there, when you come across the name in Hebrew, you read Adonai, which means Lord. But then there are a number of other places in the Hebrew Bible where it uses the word Adonai, meaning Lord, just as a generic word, the Lord, like my Lord or Lord, the Lord, and sometimes referring to God as that rather than as the name. And so then there are a number of places where God is referred to as Lord plus the name. So my Lord, the name, which then when you come across in Hebrew, you can read it as Adonai, Adonai. Now, there is another circumlocution that's kind of come to be used with that more often, where when you have that doubling to prevent the sort of weirdness of the doubling, you might say Adonai Elohim as a way to designate that that you're dealing with something else. So in that case, you don't read the name with Adonai because it's preceded by or immediately followed by Adonai. But essentially, I just sort of filed that away and was like, oh, that's interesting. Jesus is probably tagging onto that. And then it wasn't until a few years later that I realized that essentially that nobody had noticed that. That I saw an interview of a major scholar who was talking about Christology in the Gospels, and he made the observation that Jesus nowhere in the Synoptics, calls himself divine or identifies himself with the name like what you see in John. And it occurred to me that, well, you do have the three weird ego emis without the I ams without a predicate in Mark, but what about the Lord thing in the Synoptics? I mean, obviously that's one you could point to, and so it occurred to me that maybe nobody had done anything on that. I did a lit review, and I talked to Kevin Rowe over at Duke. I was at UNC at the time, and I was taking half my classes at Duke anyway. And Kevin had just published a book on Lord in Luke Acts, and I was like, well, he's going to be more familiar with this than anybody. And I dropped by him and said, hey, Kevin, what's been done on this? And he looked at me funny and he went, nothing that I know of. And honestly, I should have noticed it too. You got to publish it. And so,
Yeah.
so basically from there, I did a lit review and discovered he was right. There was nothing else that really had been done asking the question. And so at that point, I went into the early Jewish material and asked the question of, okay, well, what happens? Are there other places where we see, say in Greek, the word Lord or kurios, doubled by itself, kurie in this case, in the vocative, in the direct address form. Do we see this anywhere else before Jesus says it this way? And it turns out the only places that we ever see this are places where it's translating the divine name plus Adonai. And that really sticks out in Greek when you have the doubled kurios and you're doing that you're reading along in Greek and you get kurie or kurios next to each other. That only happens in those cases, and it's completely absent from the literary record otherwise. And so my basic argument is that this is a way, and it happens to be the first time in Matthew where Jesus is identified as kurios, as Lord, when he refers to himself as the doubled Lord in that case, and the same in Luke. So it sets the tone for who you think this Lord is, where Lord could be in Greek, Lord could be it could be ambiguous. You could, it can mean sir, essentially, or master or something like that. Or it can refer to the name, just like Adonai can of the name in Hebrew. But if you double it, that sort of removes the ambiguity. That's my argument. And so that in these places in Matthew and Luke, it front loads the idea that when you hear Jesus called Lord in the Gospels, you should be identifying him with the name as the carrier of the name of the God of Israel.
Yeah, and going now to the Old Testament and other Jewish sources that have interpreted, that circumlocution of, Adonai, the way of referring to God with the two lords, if you will. You look at all kinds of evidence from the Greek, the Aramaic. Can you just walk us through briefly the evidence that you looked at?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I tried to do is I tried to look at what evidence we have that, are there manuscripts that we have that actually predate the Gospels? Because
Right.
it's one thing if we're dealing with a bunch of manuscripts that are all post Gospels, maybe they're much older texts, but the manuscripts are copied later, then perhaps they're actually influenced by. So I tried to go
Yeah.
back to the earliest stuff we could. And there are some examples of things that we can see in terms of how these things are actually working. So I looked at Papyrus Fuad 266b, for example, which is a first century BCE text. And there, essentially, you have it's a Greek text, and when you get to the name, you would have you had a blank space where they didn't translate the name at all, and they didn't put the name in at all, and then there's just a high dot there, and then a second scribe came along and filled in the name in Hebrew in Aramaic block script, and so that's one example. And of course, the question then to ask is, okay, well, what does a reader who has this in the first century BCE, who's reading this in Greek, let's say you're reading this aloud in a liturgical context, and you're reading a Greek passage in a Greek-speaking synagogue, and then you come across this word that is definitely not Greek. What happens? What do you read? And you had a number of other examples that are similar to this. You get Aramaic block script in that case, but there are a number of others. There are some early manuscripts that are not transmitted by Christians that preserve the tetragram, the name in Paleo Hebrew script. So that's an even older way of writing that. But again, it's in Greek, and then all of a sudden you have a transition to Paleo Hebrew for the name. And then there are a few examples where you get the Greek letters P iota, which looks like the name written in block script. So it suggests that maybe at that point you have a scribe that is trying to copy that but doesn't know how to do it, which it's interesting because then there seems to have been some readers who, ignorant of how this was supposed to be read, once you got to there, actually would read this as PP. So because that's what it looks like when you put those letters together in Greek. But of course, if you turn it around and you read it backwards, and you know that that's supposed to be Aramaic block, then you know what that's figuring or what that's going into. And then actually get later Aramaic Syriac copies that have the same that are clearly from a Greek copy that have PP as well in there. And then there's some transliterations of the name where you get iota, alpha, omega, for example, Yao, that is used in certain cases. And then sometimes you get 2 yods, you get 4 dots. There's a variety of different ways that this is done in non-Christian, very early manuscripts. What we don't really see is direct translation to the Greek word kurios until about the 2nd century CE. So all this goes to show that they're really trying to differentiate the name in their manuscripts at a very early date and set that off from specific Greek language stuff. So they're trying to do that. And some scribes, as a result, concluded, or some Christian scholars have concluded as a result that, well, this is a Christian standardization. The old Greek didn't use kurios for that. But the problem is that when you're coming across, as I mentioned, when you're coming across that foreign language word in a totally different script that most Greek readers obviously would have no idea really what to do with if they're trying to read the different script. The question is, what do you vocalize when you actually read that?
Mm-hmm.
And there we actually have other evidence, including Origen and Jerome and others, who actually testify. They say, well, the oldest manuscripts and the most reliable manuscripts we have access to now, they don't have kurios in there. They have the name. They have they have Hebrew characters there instead. But when when readers read that, when they get to that, they know to read kurios. That's what they say. And that part, I think, is the important piece here, is what's on the, and it's in that case, it's just like in the modern world. When you read the tetragram in Hebrew, you don't read what's on the page. You don't read the consonants. You know, by tradition and by training, if you are literate in the Hebrew Bible in any way, you know not to read, not to vocalize that as it's written on the page. You know to read Adonai, or in some cases Hashem. You know to do that. And essentially, I argue that the evidence is pretty strong that this tradition is already pretty strongly in place by the time you get to the first century. That when you get to, say, Papyrus Fuad, that is a century before Jesus, that the scribe who comes across that and reads it, yeah, it's in Aramaic block. What's he actually going to read when that's actually read aloud? He's going to say kurios. And so once you have that in the tradition, now what that basically does is it establishes that you do have that as an early circumlocution for the name of the God of Israel. And then that sort of function that works its way out into how this can function in the Gospels. So that's essentially sort of the early spade work of looking at all of that early manuscript evidence to set up, okay, is this a plausible explanation for what's happening in Matthew and Luke in terms of how they're understanding kurios? And I think the case is pretty open and shut once you actually look at all of that evidence.
Right. So before the Gospels, you see in the evidence a kind of doubling of the name or the expression of it somehow. And then what you see in later sources is that when this doubling was read out loud, depending on, if it was, let's say, if someone just preserved the Hebrew characters, or they had to get to a part where they had to read it in a certain way aloud, they would use kurios, kurios, or kyrie, kyrie, right? Both times. They would have that circumlocution on hand.
Right. That once you have the doubling,
right.
Once you have those situations where there are a number of places in the Hebrew Bible, there's 319 places in the Masoretic text. So our current normative Hebrew Bible, there are 319 places where Adonai plus the name occur back to back. 217 of those are in Ezekiel, by the way. So it's really, really heavy in Ezekiel. It's Adonai, Adonai said to me, Son of Man, etc. Right. And I said to Adonai, 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 these sorts of things. So this is pretty common. There are, and a lot of the other ones, by the way, are in the Psalms. But when you have that as a commonality within that text. Now the question is, okay, how is that actually rendered in those manuscripts? And in most cases, those manuscripts are either going to have two kurioses right next to each other, or in some cases, the manuscripts that we have now only have one kurios where there's an Adonai Adonai in there. And my proposal there is that actually that probably is a later derivation from, there may have been a space left for filling in block, or there was block in an earlier manuscript, and they just that just sort of dropped out as they're copying later on. But readers in Jesus' day would almost certainly have come across that when they would have come across that in Greek, would have read it kurios, kurios, or kyrie, kyrie.
Right.
And so yeah, that doubling it's frequent enough. Again, 217 times in Ezekiel, you're gonna notice it there, especially since it's a fairly awkward doubling. That once you're familiar with that sound, if you hear it again, it's going to stick out. And that's essentially
Mm.
my case coming out of the early Jewish evidence, essentially.
Right. So yeah, we moved now to, in Jesus's time, they would have recognized the significance of what he was saying here. Sometimes for English readers, as we're looking at, the passages that you cite, like Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 to 22, Matthew 25:11, Luke 6:46. We might look at these passages and just kind of, overlook them, right? And think maybe something else is going on. But then you're saying even in Jesus's time, they would have recognized that something significant was happening with that doubling. So before we get into your interpretation, which you defend in the paper, it'd be maybe worth looking into what some other Christians have traditionally viewed this doubling as meaning. You also talk about a pathos interpretation, right? So maybe some people have a very kind of like it's kind of maybe just showing respect or a kind of a high expression of emotion, right? What are the
Lord, Lord, please, this sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah, what are the interpretations here on what's going on in this passage?
Yeah. So, I mean, those are options, right? Is, that you have some sort of, one of my favorites is that this is just typical Semitic doubling. Well, there's a non-explanation, right? I mean, Matthew and Luke just happen to be borrowing from standard Semitic doubling. Sometimes those Semitic people, they're silly. They just double things once in a while. Yeah, that I don't think that that's um, a good explanation. And then um, the most common one is that this is, as you said, a pathetic
Mm-hmm.
thing where it's someone calling out, Lord, Lord. This idea of the doubling expresses sort of desperation or something like that, or heightened emotion. Beyond that, the only other Frenchkowski, who is he's the one exception who had suggested that the doubling is like an acclamation of Jesus as king. So Lord, Lord,
Right.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the basic other options that have basically been put on the table before my argument, and suffice to say, I don't find any of them satisfying.
Right. Right. And why would that be the case? Why would we want to go with your interpretation instead? Give me the pitch. Give me the argument.
Yeah. So, I mean, once my argument is basically once you
Mm,
have a strong, uh, a lot of evidence that you have this doubled kurios in pre-Christian literature that's used regularly as a way of rendering Adonai plus the name. Uh, Once that's something that's sort of in the air, my argument is that it would stick out to a reader who's familiar with it the way that it did for me in reverse. So
hmm
I'm familiar with that kurios, in class, I was familiar with that kurios, or kurie, or if you want more Greek, more modern Greek, kyrie, something like
mm,
that. Uh, I was more familiar with that from the New Testament. And when I heard it in the Hebrew Bible, it immediately jarred my attention. Like, oh wow, that there's a connection here.
hmm
My argument is essentially that it would work the same thing would happen, but in the opposite, for someone who is a regular reader of the Septuagint or early
mm,
Jewish literature, who would come across kurios, or kurie in their text. If you're used to hearing Lord, Lord, and every other time that you hear Lord, Lord, this is a way of specifically and explicitly referring to the God of Israel by name. And that's just convention.
mm,
And then you hear Jesus as a character in the Gospel of Mark or in the Gospel of Luke use it of himself. It's going to be jarring. You're going to go, oh, like that, like he's using the name,
hmm
because otherwise, why would you double this? And again, my argument here is that
hmm
essentially in every extant example of Jewish literature outside the Gospels before the Talmud, so sixth century CE,
mm,
every example that we have of the doubled kurios represents a Greek rendering of Adonai plus the name in Hebrew.
Mm.
So if that's the case, then you've got a pretty strong convention. And it's not like it's that rare. Um, you've got a pretty strong convention. And I think Matthew and Luke are expecting their readers to have, reasonable exposure to the Septuagint,
Mm.
to the Greek Bible. And so for those readers who are familiar with, say, Greek Ezekiel, where that's going to be something that shows up a good bit, or in the Greek Psalms where that shows up a good bit, uh, I think that the echo is going to ring pretty loudly for those readers when they hear the doubled kurios. That's something that's going to stick out as a, oh, this that every other time I've ever heard that is in my Bible when it's explicitly and unambiguously referring to the name
Mm.
of the God of Israel, as opposed to the single kurios. There's a lot of times in, regular speech where you might just use that of, referring to the, local person, to a local man with respect, that
Mm.
sort of thing. So, but with the doubled form, you don't see that in any other literature except for referring to the name. So my argument is essentially that it would ring in the ears of anybody familiar with the Greek Bible.
Right. You have this already available illusion. You have this established convention. I mean, you're not saying that the other interpretations are impossible or incompatible with yours. You could, out of a great expression of emotion, say to Jesus, Adonai, right? You're calling out to him for help, and you recognize him as God. So your interpretation then is this really, I guess for some people it's going to be very surprising, right? But I mean, you are saying that Jesus is identifying himself as the God of Israel. Am I understanding you properly?
So I think I would clarify that just a little bit.
Sure. Hmm.
So I would say that Jesus is asserting his right to be his is asserting his identification with the name.
Right.
So there are a few different ways of reading that. One is Jesus saying, "I am the God of Israel," right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that's a straightforward reading. I think it's a defensible reading, and it might be right. Um, but there is another way to read this in line with sort of the Davidic king, or even the priest having the name put upon him, being a carrier of the name.
Mm.
So there's some reason to think, if you read the Psalms, for example, that the Davidic king takes on the name of the God of Israel, not as a homoousia, not
Yeah.
as the same substance as the God of Israel, as it were,
Sure.
but as the carrier of and proper representative of that deity.
Mm.
So one can argue that that's what's happening in Matthew and Luke. That, okay, well, Jesus is not identifying himself as the God of Israel, but he's identifying himself with the God of Israel. I mean, I think you can
Mm.
really try to parse that out, and I think that's a defensible argument as well. I think the main thing, though, is that there isn't really an option in which Jesus is not taking on a very strong identification that labels him with the name. And
Mm.
I think we've already got other examples in the earliest layers of Christianity. Philippians predates
Hmm.
Mark and Matthew and Luke. Philippians says that Jesus, upon you know emptying himself and submitting himself to death and all of this, it says, therefore God has highly exalted him
Hmm.
and has given him the name that is above every other name. Well, any reader who is familiar with Judaism is going to know what that name is. The name that's above every name is the covenantal name of Adonai. It's that name. And so Jesus, on the resurrection, receives the authority and the power of having the name that in Philippians it says God exalts him and gives him that name. And God bestows that name upon him. And you see that he shares essentially the throne of God, having that name, and is exalted in that way. You have similarly in Romans, you have the basic creedal formulation of the Pauline church is Jesus, Christos,
Mhm.
Jesus, Jesus, or I'm sorry, Jesus Kurios. Jesus is Lord, right? So this being the thing that like you confess on becoming a part of on accepting Jesus or recognizing Jesus or pledging your, this is in the context of Romans 10 where it's anyone who confesses with their mouth or pledges allegiance with his mouth
Mhm.
uh, and is is faithful in his heart or believes in his heart, trusts in his heart, Jesu Kyrie, right, or Jesu Kurios, that Jesus is Lord, uh, will be saved, right? This is the idea there. Well, you have in this context a pledge of Jesus' identity as having, I think you can argue, and I think you can read that as Jesus has the name of the above all names.
Mhm.
This, if that's how we're reading that, and I think you can combine Philippians 2 with Romans 10 to see that that's what the early confession in the Pauline church is. And then you go back and you read Matthew and Luke, and you see the doubling there, and you see what they're doing with kurios, you go, okay, well, again, this is probably a way of designating that Jesus has, by right, he has the name, that the name rightly applies to him, and he is identified with, at least, if not as, the God of Israel.
Mhm. The last question that I want to get to is discussing the ramifications, because it was interesting when I was reading your paper that you don't just talk about the name, right, and its association with Jesus, but you also discuss the fuller context of what these passages are talking about, especially in terms of soteriology. And I just realized that I probably should have read earlier, what these passages were. So I'm going to do that right now, really quick, because it's going to help bring context to what we're saying. But yeah, so like in Matthew 7:21-2, it says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." And by the way, these are your translations. You
Yeah.
you keep the Greek though, so just
Yeah.
want to put that out there. So not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me in that day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name, and in your name do many powerful things?" And then in Matthew 25:11, later the remaining virgins will come and say, "Lord, Lord, open for us." And then finally, Luke 6:46, "Why do you address me as Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" All right, so we have these passages here. You already discussed your interpretation that Jesus, in some way, is saying the divine name, right, can be applied to him. He has received it, right? We don't have to just get it from Paul's word and the other Christians' words. Jesus himself, in his own mouth, in the synoptics, is saying the name can be given to me. So, what's the connection of all this then to salvation?
Okay, so there's a few layers here, and first of all, by the way, the I should mention that the notion of heightened emotion doesn't really apply, say, to Luke 6:46.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you call me or address me as Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?
Mm,
There's no heightened emotion there. This is, you are calling me this, and then you're not doing what I say, and that's a contradiction. Well,
right.
if this thing that you're calling me identifies me with the God of Israel, then that's kind of an important thing, and you ought to obey me then,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the implication there if we read it that way. And I think that one in particular is sort of a little bit of a smoking gun in terms of what's going on here. But the interesting thing is that in at least two of these three passages, and I think I would argue in all three, or did argue that in all three, they are in the context of judgment, so that Jesus holds the name in the context of judgment. That people are standing before Jesus essentially, or they are responsible to Jesus, who, as the judge, is able to or has the authority to declare what should and should not, what must and must not be done. And he's ultimately the arbiter of what is right and what's wrong in these cases. And so the interesting thing is that they also are uh, they are presuming that it is actually not enough. So and
Mm,
this is especially true in Matthew 7 and then the Luke 6:46 one. They're arguing specifically that simply confessing Jesus as, or calling Jesus, referring to Jesus as Lord, is insufficient. So one could wonder, and one could argue at least that this is in dialogue with Paul's statement. Everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Those who say Jesus is Lord, that they're the ones who are in. Each of these pieces argues that, okay, well, good, Lord, you are labeling me Lord, Lord. So I am. All right, that's a good start. However, that is insufficient because that recognition must be followed up with obedience, right? So not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, that actually argues against the idea that calling Jesus Lord, Lord is actually enough to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's presuming that somebody might actually think that. And this is coming in as a warning to say that's insufficient if it's not paired with obedience. The obedience that is presumed by that confession. So you confess that, you pledge your allegiance. If you don't then show your allegiance by obedience, then that is insufficient. And you see the same thing in Luke, where why would you refer to me by this and then not do what I say? Right. So in each case, the idea is that that behavior is both that obeying what Jesus says to do is necessary for entry into the kingdom of heaven, or salvation, whatever you want to call that. And it also is the appropriate response to recognizing Jesus as the correct and proper bearer of the name. So yeah, that's basically my reading of those three passages, essentially, in brief.
Well, Dr. Staples, that's all I got for you today, but I appreciate the time that you're able to contribute to do this interview. And Matthew Thomas, when he sent me the paper, well, he first told me about it, and then he sent me the paper. He highly praised it, and I think when you were on the Myth Vision podcast, the host was talking about how you have this reputation among your colleagues as being a very studious and kind of making sure no stone is left unturned. And so I appreciate the rigor, especially when I looked at the paper. When I finished the paper, I was thinking, like, what other questions could I possibly ask that the paper hasn't somehow tackled? Maybe there are others that I could think of, but I think you did a really great job, and so I appreciate it.
That's really. I'm really grateful to hear that. I do put a lot of work into these, and I've become an exceedingly slow writer in the effort to try to really be someone who's thorough, and so it's very gratifying, and I appreciate hearing that it was valuable in some way.
So where can we find the rest of your work? Do you have a website, YouTube channel? Where can we find you?
So the easiest way is I do have a website, jasonstaples.com. I'm actually in the process. Now that this second book is coming out, I've been working towards getting a YouTube channel and other things launched, along with a podcast called the Bible Pod that I'll be launching as well here probably later this year, as I'm getting all this finally off the ground. Told myself I would not do it until I finished my really big project, which the second book was the last piece of it. So that's something I'm excited to get to do this year. So depending on when your audience is actually listening to this, I assume that this will be evergreen content for a long time. Right now, the Bible Pod stuff won't be up, and that YouTube channel won't be up. And so, jasonstaples.com is the best place to go for that. But hopefully within the next few months, I'll have some other options out there, and of course, you can find me through all sorts of different social media as well. Just at Jason Staples is the easiest, and yeah, all over the place. I'm not hard to find.